June 1944, dawn breaks over the vast Pacific. A lone B-2 for Liberator cuts through the low-hanging mist, engines humming like a distant storm. Below, the island of Saipan emerges from an emerald fortress carved from volcanic rock, its beaches bristling with gun emplacements, bunkers, and the glint of artillery aimed at the horizon. From the air, the Japanese fortifications appear impregnable. Trenches snake across ridges, tunnels vanish into sheer cliffs, and thousands of soldiers, over 110,000, wait silently, disciplined, resolute. Each man knows the orders: hold at all costs. Every observation post, every pillbox, every hidden cannon is positioned to turn any approach into a killing field. Inside the cockpit, the American pilots grip their controls. They know the danger below, yet their mission is clear. They will not meet the enemy head-on, they will bypass him. Strategy, speed, and surprise are their weapons. The fortress, immense and terrifying, seems unconquerable. Yet in the shadows of the cliffs, the first waves of US bombers are already moving, and a decision that will redefine the Pacific War is about to unfold. By 1943, the Pacific War had reached a pivotal stage. Japan, after its rapid expansion across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, had established a sprawling defensive network designed to make any Allied assault costly and protracted. These were not merely islands, they were fortresses. Coral, cliffs, dense jungles, and volcanic ridges were transformed into natural defensive barriers, reinforced with concrete bunkers, artillery emplacements, and interconnecting tunnels. Commanders in Tokyo envisioned a ring of impregnable positions, where each island could hold tens of thousands of troops, leading the invader dry before it could reach the Japanese home islands. Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima were among the most fortified. Intelligence reports estimated Saipan alone would house over 30,000 Japanese soldiers, with artillery capable of targeting every landing beach. Trenches and pillboxes were layered to create overlapping fields of fire. Every hilltop, ridge, and cliffside was prepared as a firing position. Engineers had carved tunnels deep into volcanic rock, allowing soldiers to disappear underground and re-emerge behind attacking forces. Anti-aircraft batteries bristled along the coasts, while coastal artillery could shell approaching ships from multiple angles. The Japanese defensive doctrine was clear: inflict maximum casualties, slow the enemy, and make every inch of ground a battlefield. The human element of these fortresses was no less formidable. Japanese troops were meticulously trained in static defense and small unit tactics. Soldiers and officers were indoctrinated with the code of Bushido: fight to the last man, never surrender. Propaganda and rigorous discipline ensured morale remained high, even under the shadow of inevitable defeat. Troops were rotated through harsh jungle training, taught to use the terrain to their advantage, and drilled to respond instantly to invasions. Civilian labor was conscripted to build fortifications, dig tunnels, and stockpile supplies, turning each island into a self-contained stronghold, capable of withstanding prolonged siege. The strategic thinking behind these defenses reflected the Japanese High Command's understanding of Allied capabilities. They assumed that any US assault would be costly and frontal, relying on massive amphibious landings against fortified beaches. Each island was stocked with artillery ranging from 75mm anti-tank guns to 150mm coastal cannons, supported by mortar, machine guns, and sniper positions, anti-landing obstacles, steel rails, sharpened stakes, and coral walls lined every beach. Observation posts were carefully camouflaged, and secondary defensive lines were established inland. No single attack could break through without overwhelming casualties yet. For all its preparation, Japan's fortress strategy had inherent vulnerabilities. Static defenses could not easily respond to mobility and air power. Troop numbers, while large, were confined to individual islands, limiting strategic flexibility. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, vulnerable to US submarine and air attacks, while the islands themselves could hold against immediate invasion. The Japanese network was not invulnerable to innovative tactics, intelligence, operations, and the growing firepower of the US Navy and Air Force. By mid-1944, the US had begun to study these fortresses in detail. Aerial reconnaissance, interceptor communications, and local intelligence provided planners with detailed maps of trenches, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. The Americans recognized the scale of the challenge. Sappin's 30,000 defenders, Peleliu's 10,000 troops, and the intricate network of bunkers at Tinian and Iwo Jima presented formidable obstacles. But rather than preparing for direct assaults on every island, the US devised an alternative: bypass the strongest points, isolate them, and strike at strategic targets, using mobility, firepower, and air superiority to render the fortresses irrelevant. The stage was set for one of the most audacious campaigns of the Pacific War. The Japanese had invested heavily in static defenses, confident that sheer numbers and fortifications could stop the Americans. Across the ocean, US strategists were preparing to prove that speed, innovation, and daring could overcome even the most impregnable positions. The morning sun rose over Saipan, glinting off reinforced bunkers and artillery emplacement. Below, soldiers sharpened bayonets and checked weapons. Unseen in the skies, American bombers were already forming up, their engines a low hum against the Pacific wind. A confrontation loomed, but one that would defy conventional expectations and force both sides to adapt in ways they had never imagined. While Japan poured men and material into fortified islands, the United States pursued a different path. One defined by mobility, innovation, and a willingness to challenge conventional logic. By 1943, the American High Command recognized that attempting to capture every Japanese-held island in the Pacific would be a costly, slow grind. Entire divisions could be decimated, assaulting well-prepared beaches, and the war could stretch indefinitely. Instead, planners devised the island-hopping strategy: bypass the strongest fortresses, seize strategically valuable positions, and use air power and naval superiority to isolate enemy garrisons. Intelligence became the backbone of this approach. Reconnaissance aircraft scoured islands, photographing bunkers, gun positions, and defensive lines with meticulous precision. Intercepted Japanese communications offered insight into troop movements and supply stockpiles. Local guerrilla networks and coast watchers provided invaluable reports on terrain, fortifications, and morale. Every detail was mapped, measured, and analyzed. Unlike the Japanese, who assumed a frontal assault, American strategists were looking for weak points, choke points, and exploitable gaps in an otherwise formidable network. Logistics were equally critical. To bypass a fortress required not just intelligence but mobility. Aircraft carriers, fast transport ships, and amphibious task forces allowed the US to project power over hundreds of miles of open ocean. Bombers and fighters could strike without committing ground troops, softening or isolating enemy positions. Naval gunfire could neutralize coastal batteries, while submarines interdicting supply lines slowly starved out garrisons left behind. In this way, an impregnable fortress could be rendered strategically irrelevant without a single direct assault. The island-hopping campaign was first tested during operations in the Gilbas and Marsh Shoals, but the lessons were applied on a grander scale in the Marianas and the Palau Islands. Saipan, for example, became a focal point. Its capture would place US bombers within range of the Japanese home islands, and its bypass or neutralization would test the balance between brute force and ingenuity. The Americans recognized that any frontal assault would be bloody, but air power and mobility offered alternatives. The challenge was to maintain momentum while avoiding the costly attrition that had defined earlier campaigns. Technological advantages further tilted the balance. US bombers could strike with precision from high altitude, while fighter escorts and long-range reconnaissance mitigated some of the risks of enemy anti-aircraft fire. Naval radar allowed task forces to detect and respond to Japanese movements before they could engage. Engineering units could construct airfields on captured islands rapidly, providing forward bases for further operations. In short, the Americans were building a network of mobility and firepower to counterbalance Japan's network of static defenses. Morale and leadership also played a decisive role. U.S. commanders Admiral Chester Nimitz, General Holland Smith, and others were determined to avoid attritional battles wherever possible. Their planning emphasized flexibility, coordination between services, and the element of surprise. Crews were trained for rapid landings, immediate construction of airfields, and precision strikes on bypassed fortresses to keep Japanese forces isolated. The human factor, the ingenuity, endurance, and adaptability of American troops became as vital as ships, planes, and artillery. The strategic gamble was enormous. Bypassing fortified islands meant leaving tens of thousands of enemy troops intact behind the front lines. If the Japanese broke out or mounted counterattacks, entire operations could be jeopardized. Yet the Americans calculated that superior mobility, overwhelming firepower, and sustained aerial dominance would prevent these garrisons from influencing the broader campaign. It was a calculated risk. Bypass fortresses, strike the weak points, and let technology and strategy do what sheer manpower could not. By mid-1944, the Pacific had become a theater of contrasts. On one side, Japanese islands bristled with trenches, guns, tunnels, and tens of thousands of soldiers trained to fight to the death. On the other hand, the Americans assembled aircraft, carriers, and task forces designed to strike where the enemy was weakest, to bypass and isolate rather than confront directly. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine how fortification strategy and human will interacted in modern warfare. As U.S. bombers lined up over the horizon and amphibious task forces advanced, the clash between impregnable fortresses and bypassing ingenuity was about to unfold, a test of strategy, technology, and human endurance that would leave an indelible mark on the Pacific War. Inside the Japanese fortresses, life was a study in tension and discipline. Thousands of soldiers lived in dugouts and caves, where humidity and heat were constant companions. Every day began with inspection and training, reinforcing skills honed for static defense. Drill and routine masked a deeper awareness. Each man understood that the moment the Americans arrived, his life would hang in the balance. Yet even in these conditions, soldiers exhibited remarkable resilience. Letters sent home revealed pride in their duty and fear interwoven with resolve. For the civilians conscripted to construct fortifications, life was no less harsh. They worked under threat of bombardment, carrying heavy materials, digging tunnels, and stacking artillery emplacements. Every person on these islands became part of a larger machine, an interconnected network whose strength was measured in manpower, discipline, and endurance. From a tactical perspective, Japan's island fortresses were masterpieces of defensive engineering. Gun emplacements were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that no landing craft could reach the beaches unscathed. Trenches and obstacles forced attackers into kill zones, while interlocking pillboxes allowed defenders to cover every approach. Inland, secondary lines of defense awaited, prepared to absorb and repel penetrations. Tunnels and hidden bunkers provided shelter and allowed troops to counterattack unexpectedly. Commanders employed depth in defense, using terrain to their advantage. Volcanic ridges, coral cliffs, and dense jungle made coordinated assaults perilous. Every fortification was designed with the assumption that attackers would come head-on, maximizing casualties and delaying advances. Technology shaped both defense and offense in this campaign. Japanese artillery ranged from coastal guns capable of shelling approaching ships to mortar and machine guns hidden in camouflage positions. Anti-aircraft batteries were layered along beaches to challenge Allied air superiority. On the American side, innovation was equally critical. B-24 and B-29 bombers could strike from high altitude, bypassing the heaviest concentrations of troops. Aircraft carriers projected naval air power far from traditional bases, while radar allowed task forces to detect enemy positions and movements before engagement. Amphibious landing craft, specialized for rapid deployment, allowed troops to approach less defended beaches, circumventing the strongest defenses. Engineers constructed airfields swiftly on captured islands, extending reach for subsequent operations. The Battle of Fortresses thus became a duel of technological ingenuity, static defenses versus mobility, firepower, and intelligence. The role of leadership in the Pacific theater was decisive. On the Japanese side, commanders like Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Sato on Saipan exemplified the ethos of tenacity and sacrifice. They meticulously organized defenses, coordinated artillery, and enforced discipline, instilling a fierce determination in troops to resist at all costs. Orders were often absolute: no surrender, no retreat. Every bunker, tunnel, and hilltop was accounted for in defensive plans, reflecting a command structure designed to maximize the fortress's effectiveness. On the American side, leaders approached the problem differently. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Holland Smith orchestrated operations that relied on coordination, intelligence, and flexibility. They emphasized bypassing heavily defended positions when possible, using mobility and overwhelming firepower to strike strategic targets instead of directly confronting every fortress. Leadership in this context was as much about innovation and adaptation as about directing troops, making calculated risks to reduce casualties while maintaining the momentum of the campaign. Morale within the Japanese garrisons was complex. Soldiers were indoctrinated with Bushido principles, committed to fighting to the last man. Yet they were acutely aware of the overwhelming industrial and technological might of the Allies. Daily bombardments, the presence of enemy reconnaissance aircraft, and reports of bypassed islands eroded confidence over time. For many, hope became an increasingly abstract faith in orders and loyalty to the emperor, replaced expectation of survival. The psychological tension was palpable. Fortified positions offered safety, yet the knowledge that American forces could circumvent them introduced uncertainty and fear. Soldiers faced a paradox, prepared to fight relentlessly, yet sometimes isolated from the main theaters of conflict. Their efforts strategically bypassed moral and strategic dilemmas. The American strategy of bypassing fortified islands created moral and strategic challenges. Leaving tens of thousands of enemy troops behind without engaging directly could be perceived as ruthless. Yet it preserved thousands of American lives. Commanders weighed the costs of frontal assaults against the risks of bypass, balancing human life with strategic objectives. For civilians forced into these fortresses, the consequences were dire. Isolated garrisons often led to shortages of food, water, and medical care, intensifying suffering. Strategically, however, bypassing allowed the U.S. to focus resources on capturing critical islands, constructing airfields, and moving closer to Japan with minimal attrition. The moral calculus of war collided with operational necessity, creating a complex landscape of decisions where human cost was ever present, even in victories achieved without direct confrontation. These perspectives, leadership, enemy psychology, and moral considerations complement the human, tactical, and technological angles, providing a multidimensional understanding of the Pacific Fortress campaigns. The contrast between immense Japanese fortifications and American bypass strategies illustrates not only the scale of the war but the ingenuity and difficult choices that defined it. July 1944. The sun rose over the Marianas, casting long shadows across coral cliffs and dense jungle. Saipan, the impregnable fortress, bristled with 30,000 Japanese defenders. Artillery pieces glinted in the morning light. Machine guns peered from pillboxes, and observation posts lined every ridge. Thousands of soldiers prepared for an assault they believed inevitable. But the Americans had chosen a different approach. Task Force 58, a formidable armada of aircraft carriers, battleships, and cruisers, lay beyond the horizon. In the skies, waves of B-24 Liberators and F-4U Corsairs formed into precise formations. Their mission was not to attack head-on but to bypass the strongest defenses and strike critical targets. Airfields, supply depots, and lightly defended outposts. The goal was audacious: to neutralize the fortress's effectiveness without engaging it directly. At 6:15, the first American bombers cut through the early haze. From above, the fortification seemed endless trenches twisting across ridges, camouflaged bunkers, and artillery zeroed on the beaches. Anti-aircraft fire erupted, sharp and relentless, yet the Americans pressed on. Bombs fell with precision, targeting key positions and supply stockpiles while leaving the main defensive lines largely intact. Pilots reported flak and smoke, but the Japanese garrison below watched in frustration and confusion. The fortress remained physically unbroken, yet its operational effectiveness began to crumble. Meanwhile, U.S. Navy engineers prepared landing zones on smaller, less defended islands. Nearby, troops landed, constructed airstrips, and established artillery positions capable of reaching the Japanese fortresses. From these new vantage points, U.S. forces could interdict supply routes, isolate garrisons, and control the surrounding seas and airspace. The strategic genius of bypassing became evident. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, ready to defend to the last man, were rendered strategically irrelevant. On Tinian, the scenario repeated. Coastal artillery bristled, yet the Americans targeted key positions and moved rapidly to seize lightly defended terrain. Airfields were captured and expanded within days. giving the US a forward base for bombing runs against Saipan and, eventually, the Japanese home islands. The Japanese command could watch, powerless, as their supposed strongholds were systematically circumvented, supply lines severed, and morale eroded. The turning point was not marked by a single decisive battle but by the cumulative effect of mobility, intelligence, and technological superiority. By mid-July, the Marianas were effectively under American control, despite the fortresses remaining largely intact. The Japanese defenders were trapped, their strength neutralized without a direct, costly assault. This operation exemplified a fundamental shift in warfare. Static fortifications, no matter how formidable, could be bypassed by a combination of air power, mobility, and precise intelligence. Japanese planners had invested heavily in manpower and engineering, yet the Americans proved that ingenuity and strategy could achieve objectives faster, with fewer casualties, and with profound psychological impact on the enemy. The implications were immediate. Japanese commanders realized that traditional defensive doctrines, relying on overwhelming fortifications and massed troops, were increasingly ineffective against an enemy that could strike at the weak points and render entire garrisons impotent. For US forces, the success validated the island-hopping strategy, demonstrating that mobility and firepower could replace attritional assaults, preserving lives while advancing toward Japan itself. As the sun set over the Marianas, the impregnable fortresses still stood physically, yet their defenders were trapped, isolated, and powerless. The audacity of bypassing fortified islands had not only achieved its strategic goal but reshaped the psychological landscape of the Pacific War. Commanders on both sides would never see static defense in the same light. Again, August 1944, the success at Saipan and Tinian set the stage for an audacious continuation of the Pacific Campaign. The Japanese had built fortresses designed to be impregnable, yet the Americans had demonstrated a new form of warfare, one where bypassing the strongest points rendered them strategically irrelevant. The psychological effect on Japanese commanders and troops was profound. Troops in isolated fortresses faced the grim realization that their sacrifices, no matter how disciplined, could be neutralized without direct engagement. In the Palau Islands, the US applied this principle once more. Fortified positions on Peleliu were left largely untouched initially, while American forces focused on capturing adjacent islands with strategic value. From these positions, artillery and airstrikes could dominate the battlefield without costly frontal assaults. Japanese soldiers, confined to their bunkers and tunnels, endured constant bombardment and dwindling supplies. Communication with higher command was severed, and the sense of inevitability weighed heavily on morale. Their fortress, intended to halt the enemy, had become a cage. The approach was not without risk. Leaving tens of thousands of enemy troops behind could have resulted in counterattacks or sorties from isolated garrisons, yet the Americans mitigated these risks through careful planning. Air superiority allowed continuous reconnaissance and strike capability. Naval forces patrolled surrounding waters, preventing resupply or evacuation. Engineers constructed forward airfields rapidly, extending operational reach and ensuring that bypassed fortresses remained contained. The US had created a system in which fortresses were rendered ineffective without a single catastrophic assault. Combining speed, mobility, and precision, Iwo Jima, later in 1945, further illustrated the consequences of fortified islands and American adaptation. Although the island was smaller, its defenses were meticulously designed. Deep tunnels, interlocking bunkers, and artillery capable of targeting any approach. The Americans, having learned from earlier bypass operations, adapted their tactics. Strategic bombing, pre-invasion naval bombardments, and selective ground assaults weakened the Japanese defenses before committing full-scale infantry. The pattern was clear. Isolating and bypassing the strongest points minimized casualties while gradually eroding the enemy's capacity to resist. The turning point was thus not confined to a single battle but represented a strategic evolution. The Japanese concept of impregnable islands had been challenged, exposed, and overcome not through brute force alone but through innovation, coordination, and a willingness to defy conventional expectations. American forces had demonstrated that fortifications, no matter how formidable, could be circumvented when strategy, intelligence, and technology converged. By late 1944, the broader consequences were evident. Islands once thought essential to all, at all costs, were now isolated pockets. Japanese supply lines across the Pacific were increasingly vulnerable. Troop morale in these bypassed fortresses deteriorated under the weight of isolation, bombardment, and the realization that strategic relevance had been stripped from their positions. The impregnable myth had been shattered. The Pacific War's momentum shifted decisively. With fortresses bypassed, American forces could advance closer to the Japanese home islands, establishing airfields for strategic bombing campaigns and bases for subsequent invasions. The scale of bypass operations also redefined operational priorities. Speed, mobility, and precision replaced attritional assaults as the preferred method of warfare. The human cost, while never eliminated, was markedly reduced compared to traditional frontal attacks against well-fortified positions. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the volcanic ridges and coral cliffs, the contrast was stark. The Japanese fortresses still stood physically, monuments to engineering and human effort, yet they were strategically hollow. American forces had rewritten the rules of engagement in the Pacific, proving that innovation, audacity, and mobility could overcome even the most formidable static defenses. By late 1944, the results of the Pacific bypass strategy were unmistakable. The Japanese fortresses, once considered unassailable, had been rendered operationally irrelevant. Saipan and Tinian were under American control, their airfields active, supply lines secured, and strategic positions firmly in Allied hands. The islands themselves bore the scars of bombardment: craters, pockmarked beaches, bunkers were shattered, and the jungle was scarred by fire, but the Americans had avoided the massive casualties that a direct frontal assault would have inflicted. The Japanese defenders, meanwhile, faced a stark reality. Tens of thousands of troops remained in fortresses on islands like Paladue and Iwo Jima, their positions isolated and supplies limited. Cut off from reinforcements, many faced starvation, disease, and relentless bombardment. The morale of these garrisons began to collapse under the psychological strain of isolation. Letters and diaries from Japanese soldiers reveal a mixture of frustration, fear, and resignation. They were prepared to fight to the last man, yet they were now strategically irrelevant, trapped in a fortress that could not influence the broader conflict. For the Americans, the campaign validated the logic of mobility over attrition. Casualties in bypassed islands were far lower than anticipated, and troops could be concentrated on objectives with high strategic value rather than dissipated in costly assaults. Forward airfields on captured islands allowed bombing raids on Japan itself, bringing the war closer to the Japanese mainland. Logistics were streamlined. Instead of committing hundreds of thousands of troops to assault every fortified position, engineers, aircraft, and small task forces could achieve disproportionate strategic effects. The psychological impact on Japanese command was significant. The aura of invincibility surrounding their fortresses was shattered. Commanders in Tokyo realized that static defense alone could not stop the Americans. Across the Pacific, the perception of impregnable fortresses was replaced by a grim awareness that mobility, intelligence, and firepower could bypass even the most meticulously prepared defenses. The strategic calculus had shifted irrevocably. American propaganda highlighted the success of bypass operations, emphasizing ingenuity and precision. For the troops, it reinforced confidence in leadership and tactics, proving that careful planning could minimize casualties while achieving objectives once thought impossible. Soldiers who had feared assaulting heavily defended beaches witnessed firsthand that victory could be achieved without the massive bloodshed that had defined earlier campaigns in the Pacific. The islands themselves, however, remained deadly landscapes. Bunkers, tunnels, and artillery positions still posed threats to reconnaissance units, and pockets of Japanese resistance persisted. These ghost fortresses required monitoring, occasional strikes, and containment to prevent them from interfering with supply lines or operations. The strategy of bypassing did not eliminate danger. It shifted the battlefield, trading direct engagement for containment, and transforming static positions into isolated, powerless enclaves. Strategically, the United States gained momentum. The capture of the Marianas placed long-range bombers, Within striking distance of the Japanese home island, Tinian's airfields would later serve as the base for the B-29 superfortress missions over Japan, including the historic atomic bomb flights. The bypass strategy allowed the Allies to dictate the tempo of the war, choosing when and where to strike while minimizing exposure to fortified positions. In contrast, Japanese forces faced an increasingly untenable situation, with fortresses bypassed, supply lines cut, and morale deteriorating. The ability to influence the broader war diminished. Attempts to reinforce or counterattack were hampered by American air and naval dominance. The psychological effect of being strategically irrelevant, despite immense personal sacrifice, compounded the physical hardships of isolation. By the end of 1944, the contrast was undeniable. The Americans had demonstrated that strategy, mobility, and technology could overcome even the most impregnable fortresses. The Japanese, despite their engineering, discipline, and sheer manpower, were forced to confront the limitations of static defense. The Pacific theater was now firmly in the hands of the Allies, and the stage was set for the final assaults on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and ultimately, the Japanese mainland. As 1945 dawned, the full consequences of the bypass strategy became evident across the Pacific. Japanese military planners faced a grim reality. Their fortresses, once symbols of unyielding power, had been neutralized without the Americans ever needing to engage them directly. Islands such as Peleliu Truk and portions of the Palau chain remained occupied by Japanese troops, but their operational impact was effectively nullified. These soldiers were trapped, isolated from reinforcements, and cut off from supplies. Even the most disciplined and courageous units could do little to influence the broader, strategic picture. The psychological toll on Japanese troops was immense. Soldiers who had prepared for heroic defense found themselves stranded in fortresses that could no longer determine the outcome of the war. Letters, diaries, and post-war testimonies reveal frustration and despair among troops who had trained for months or years, only to realize that their sacrifices were strategically irrelevant. The ethos of Bushido, emphasizing honor through combat and resistance to the last man, clashed with the reality of being bypassed. Many were left in limbo, living under constant bombardment while unable to affect the enemy's advance. For the Americans, the bypass operations solidified the strategic advantages of mobility and precision by concentrating forces on islands with strategic value. The Allies maintained operational momentum, minimized casualties, and established airfields that brought Japan itself within range. Saipan and Tinian's airfields became crucial for B-29 superfortress raids, while forward bases allowed naval forces to dominate surrounding seas. The approach demonstrated that attritional warfare, the costly frontal assaults that had defined earlier Pacific campaigns, could be replaced by strategy, intelligence, and technological superiority. The success of bypassing fortresses also reshaped Allied thinking about the nature of warfare. Commanders recognized that heavily fortified positions were not invincible if the enemy could exploit mobility, intelligence, and firepower. The focus shifted from conquering every obstacle to neutralizing its strategic significance. Isolated garrisons required monitoring but no longer demanded direct high-casualty assaults. In effect, the battlefield expanded vertically and horizontally. Air, sea, and intelligence replaced sheer manpower in determining outcomes. The Japanese high command faced difficult choices. Attempting to reinforce isolated fortresses was increasingly impossible. Submarines and convoys were intercepted, air superiority prevented resupply, and garrisons had no means to influence broader battles. Their once mighty Pacific defensive network was now a series of isolated, impotent positions. The strategic gamble of constructing impregnable fortresses had failed not due to a lack of effort or discipline but because warfare had evolved. Mobility and intelligence now outweighed static defenses. On the human level, the bypass strategy preserved American lives while forcing Japanese troops to endure hardship, starvation, and psychological strain. It underscored the stark asymmetry of the Pacific War. Technological and strategic superiority could achieve objectives while minimizing direct engagement, whereas brute force alone could not guarantee success. The campaign's legacy was clear. Fortifications, no matter how meticulously engineered, were only as effective as their integration into a flexible, responsive strategy. By mid-1945, the Americans had reached Okinawa, and plans were underway for the invasion of Japan itself. The lessons of bypassed fortresses informed every operational decision. Commanders knew the value of isolating strongpoints rather than engaging them directly unless necessary, of leveraging air and naval power to control territory, and of exploiting intelligence to target critical vulnerabilities. The bypass operations had not only shifted momentum but fundamentally changed the approach to warfare in the Pacific. The isolated Japanese garrisons remained as stark reminders of the changing nature of conflict, monuments to discipline, courage, and engineering, yet rendered irrelevant by strategy and mobility. Across the Pacific, the war's tide had irrevocably turned. The Americans had shown that even the most formidable human and mechanical defenses could be circumvented, and in doing so, they had redefined the rules of engagement for modern warfare. As the smoke cleared over the islands, the strategic landscape was transformed. Fortresses that had once seemed impregnable now symbolized the limits of static defense in an era defined by speed, intelligence, and technological dominance. The Pacific War was no longer a series of battles against isolated fortifications. It had become a campaign of maneuver, innovation, and overwhelming operational reach, a reality that would shape the conclusion of World War II. The story of Japan's impregnable fortresses and the American strategy to bypass them offers a profound lesson in the evolution of warfare. Across the Pacific, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers had prepared meticulously for battle, constructing tunnels, bunkers, and artillery positions designed to withstand the most determined assault. Their courage, discipline, and ingenuity were undeniable. Yet, in the end, strategy and mobility proved more decisive than fortifications alone. The campaign illustrates a fundamental truth. No matter how formidable a defensive position may appear, its effectiveness is ultimately determined by context, adaptability, and the enemy's capacity for innovation. The Americans demonstrated that intelligence, technology, and strategic foresight could neutralize even the most imposing obstacles. By bypassing fortified islands, isolating garrisons, and leveraging air and naval superiority, they achieved objectives once thought impossible without incurring catastrophic casualties. Beyond strategy, the campaign underscores the human dimension of warfare. Japanese soldiers endured extreme hardship, fighting in positions that had become irrelevant to the larger conflict. American troops, in contrast, experienced the benefits of meticulous planning and mobility, preserving lives while advancing toward victory. Both sides were bound by courage, determination, and the realities of their circumstances. Yet the outcome was determined not by bravery alone but by the ability to adapt and innovate under pressure. Ultimately, the Pacific bypass operations reshaped the nature of modern conflict. They demonstrated that warfare was no longer solely about numbers and fortifications. It was about flexibility, intelligence, and the strategic application of technological advantage. Fortresses that once seemed impregnable became symbols of the limitations of static defense in an age defined by speed and maneuver. As the smoke lifted over the Marianas, the Palau Islands, and Iwo Jima, the human and strategic lessons remained. Clear warfare is not merely about holding ground. It is about understanding how to shape the battlefield, exploit opportunities, and achieve objectives with precision. The legacy of these campaigns endures as a testament to the power of strategy, the ingenuity of human adaptation, and the sobering reality that even the strongest walls cannot withstand a mind prepared to move beyond them.